Enter into a realm of fright, blacker than the darkest night. Your sanity hangs by a thread. Welcome to the House of Dread.
Karma. A word that essentially means what goes around comes around. Now, although this makes perfect sense and sounds like timeless wisdom, did you ever know someone who just didn't seem to understand or take seriously the importance of treating people the way they wanted to be treated? For reasons unknown, they perceived themselves to be above consequences and the principles of cause and effect. Perhaps they simply thought they were too smart to suffer repercussions, or that the rules just didn't apply to them. If you've ever known such a person, did you make an effort to let them know that one day their ways would catch up to them? Or did you simply sit back and allow karma to take its course? Enter Eddie. An energetic and vibrant young man in his early 20s, Eddie was the quintessential practical joker. He possessed an odd passion for scaring the living daylights out of people. Yes, Eddie was always looking for new and inventive ways to startle and frighten his friends, family, and even strangers. He took great delight in jumping out from behind corners, setting up elaborate hoaxes, and basically reveling in the distress of those around him. So, what made him like this? Well, Eddie had a very troubled childhood. He grew up in a dysfunctional family where fear and uncertainty were his constant companions. Eddie's father, a volatile man, would often experience rapid mood shifts, going from calm and affectionate to explosive and violent without any clear warning or explanation. This inconsistency made it difficult for Eddie to develop a sense of trust and stability. Eddie's mother, struggling to cope with the emotional distress within their household, often withdrew into herself, and she would spend hours locked in her room, leaving Eddie feeling neglected, unwanted, and abandoned. In addition, their household was not immune to physical confrontations. Eddie often witnessed his parents in the heat of violent arguments. The constant exposure to such extremes desensitized Eddie and caused him to become deeply emotionally scarred. Both of Eddie's parents were also known to resort to verbal abuse, criticizing and belittling Eddie in front of the entire family. Then, if all of that wasn't enough, Eddie was also the target of bullying and constant pranks at his school. Eddie was teased about everything from the clothes he wore to the way he spoke and even the way he walked. Poor Eddie, he couldn't catch a break to save his life. He faced adversity both at school and at home. Eddie was plagued with feelings of perpetual powerlessness, and he learned very early on in his life that there really was no rest for the weary. As Eddie grew into an adult, he began to subconsciously take his power back. This manifested in him developing a sadistic fetish for scaring the holy hell out of people. In essence, Eddie learned to cope with his own fear by projecting it onto others, turning the fear of those around him into his own twisted form of comfort and control. Now, to Eddie's credit, He had turned the art of scaring people into something of a masterpiece. He didn't stop at simply jumping out from behind corners. Oh no. Oftentimes, Eddie's approach was far more sophisticated and creative. He had a knack for understanding exactly what made people tick, what made their hearts race and their spines tingle with fear. Eddie was a master at setting the stage, using shadows and sounds to build tension. He knew the perfect moment to strike, the exact second when a person's guard was down and when their anticipation was at its peak. Eddie's jump scares were not random. They were well thought out performances, each tailored to the individual. Eddie studied his friends and even strangers, learning their fears and phobias in order to craft the perfect scare. It was as if he had a sixth sense for detecting what lurked in the darkest corners of their minds. People often warned that if you had any sort of fear or phobia, it was best to keep it hidden from Eddie. He was known for ruthlessly exploiting other people's vulnerabilities, turning their terror into his own sickening source of pleasure and amusement. Yes, Eddie's traumatic childhood experiences had manifested into an unhealthy coping mechanism. Eddie's need to feel in control stemmed from the instability and unpredictability he faced growing up. The volatile outbursts and physical altercations between his parents, combined with their verbal abuse and emotional neglect, left Eddie with a profound sense of powerlessness. The bullying at his school only compounded these feelings, pushing Eddie to find ways to regain a sense of dominance. By scaring and tormenting others, Eddie was able to temporarily alleviate his own inner turmoil. The adrenaline rush he experienced and the knowledge that he had the power to frighten people provided momentary relief for his wounded psyche. However, this maladaptive coping strategy only served to further isolate him, as people became wary of his cruel pranks and unpredictable behavior. People warned Eddie that one day somebody was going to scare the bejesus out of him. But the problem was that Eddie didn't scare so easily. Growing up in a dysfunctional and abusive family had given Eddie nerves of steel and made him immune to fear, or so he thought. He was confident and borderline arrogant about his ability to resist people's efforts to try and turn the tables on him. One day, Eddie received an unexpected phone call. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something urged him to answer it. On the other end of the line was a voice from the past, one that had been absent for far too long. It was his grandfather, a man whose presence in Eddie's life had been as distant as a fading dream. The old man's voice, cracked with age but warm with affection, broke through the years of silence. He told Eddie he was coming to visit, a statement that filled Eddie with a mix of excitement and a hint of unease. Eddie hadn't seen his grandfather since he was a little boy, and his memories of those times were like old photographs, faded and frayed at the edges. Eddie's grandfather, a retired teacher, was known for his gentle nature and patience. He spent his life educating children and instilling values of hard work and persistence. He was also a skilled woodcarver, creating intricate and delicate sculptures that showcased his artistic talent and attention to detail. A widower, still deeply in love with his late wife, Eddie's grandfather lived alone. But despite his age, he remained physically active and engaged in the community, volunteering at local schools and community centers. Although Eddie was thrilled at the prospect of seeing his grandfather for the first time in so many years, a part of him was expecting a bit of an awkward visit, since he wasn't sure how his grandfather would react to seeing him all grown up. Nevertheless, Eddie decided he would make the most of this opportunity to reconnect with his grandfather and potentially build a bridge of understanding and shared memories that had been missing for so long. On the day Eddie's grandfather was due to arrive, the air seemed to buzz with a quiet anticipation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced across the ground, as if nature itself was preparing for a momentous occasion. Eddie found himself pacing back and forth in the small living room of his apartment, each step echoing the rapid beat of his heart. The years of distance and silence lay heavily between them, a thick fog of uncertainty that Eddie hoped the day's light would finally clear. Finally, the moment arrived. The sound of footsteps approached, each step heavy with years of life lived and lessons learned. Eddie's heart pounded louder, a symphony of anticipation and fear. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and Eddie reluctantly answered. There stood his grandfather, a figure from the past, yet vibrant with the energy of someone who had not yet given up on life. A tall figure with lines of wisdom etched deeply into his face, but who sparkled with the same kindness and warmth that Eddie remembered from his childhood. The reunion was awkward at first, the years of separation creating an invisible barrier that both of them hesitated to cross. "How you doing, Eddie?" Eddie stood still, his eyes locked with his grandfather's. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken words and emotions that had piled up over the years. "How you doing, Grandpa?" On the verge of tears, Eddie managed a weak smile. The two men embraced in a hug that seemed to break years of silence, melting away the distance that time had created. Later that evening, Eddie and his grandfather sat across from each other at the dinner table. Now it was just the two of them, surrounded by the quiet hum of the evening. The initial awkwardness of their reunion had slowly faded as they shared stories and caught up on lost time. Eddie's grandfather, with his weathered hands and wise eyes, listened intently, nodding and smiling at just the right moments. Eddie, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity, found himself opening up more than he had to anyone in years. As Eddie and his grandfather sat across from each other enjoying their evening meal together, the air was filled with the soft clinking of cutlery and the warm aroma of home-cooked food. The evening had unfolded into a cozy gathering, just the two of them, sharing stories and laughter. However, as their meal neared its end, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Eddie's grandfather, with a thoughtful look in his eyes, leaned slightly across the table, lowering his voice as if to share a secret. He mentioned to Eddie that there was something important he needed to discuss with him before the night was over. Eager to know what his grandfather had on his mind, Eddie also leaned in, his eyes wide with curiosity. But just as Eddie's grandfather was about to reveal his thoughts, he paused. Shaking his head, he told Eddie it would probably be best if he held off until later. Confused, Eddie insisted, but his grandfather remained firm in his decision. The air between them grew thick with anticipation and a hint of worry. Eddie couldn't help but wonder why his grandfather had decided to hold back. And as they cleared the table and said their goodnights, Eddie's mind raced with possibilities. But Eddie also respected his grandfather's decision to postpone their conversation, and he decided he wouldn't pressure him into revealing the secret that seemed to weigh so heavily on his heart. As it turns out, Eddie and his grandfather were truly enjoying each other's company. They were experiencing a level of bonding that prior to the visit, Eddie could have only dreamed of. Their level of connection was deeper than ever before, and Eddie found himself feeling a sense of warmth and belonging that he had never known with his narcissistic and dysfunctional parents. About 2 days before Eddie's grandfather was scheduled to leave, Eddie got one hell of an idea. Feeling particularly playful, Eddie felt inspired to play a practical joke on his grandfather. And by practical joke, Eddie meant he wanted to give his grandfather a good scare. He figured it would be something that would make the both of them laugh and add a touch of fun to their last few moments together. One morning, Eddie's grandfather was in the shower, and Eddie was preparing to make them breakfast, when suddenly he realized that now would be a good time to stage his prank. Eddie cracked open the door to the bathroom, calling inside to inform his grandfather that he would be making a quick run to the grocery store to pick up a few items for their breakfast. Eddie's grandfather called out from the shower, letting him know that was perfectly fine and that he would be there when Eddie returned. Eddie jingled his keys as he opened and closed the door to his apartment, making sure to make enough noise so that his grandfather could hear that he had left. Then Eddie tiptoed back to his bedroom to retrieve a horrific Halloween mask he had hidden away in his closet. Eddie quickly and stealthily made his way to his room, heart pounding with excitement and anticipation. The mask Eddie held in his hands felt cool and slightly clammy, its grotesque features twisted in a permanent snarl that would send shivers down anyone's spine. It was a gargoyle mask, complete with sharp teeth, horned eyebrows, and a look of petrified rage. He slipped it on, adjusting the mask so that it fit perfectly. Looking in the mirror, he felt a thrill of excitement. This would definitely give his grandfather a good scare. Eddie waited patiently for his grandfather to get out of the shower, and finally he could hear the water shutting off, followed by the sound of towels being rustled. Eddie's heart was pounding in his ears as he silently made his way down the hall and hid behind the living room couch. Eventually, Eddie's grandfather came out of the bathroom, got dressed, and decided to venture into the living room to watch a bit of TV while he waited for Eddie to return from the store. Totally unaware that Eddie was still in the house, Eddie's grandfather sat down on the couch, grabbed the remote control, and began channel surfing. Hypnotized by the flashing images on the screen, Eddie's grandfather was completely oblivious to the fact that he was mere inches away from his grandson, who in just a few seconds would be lurching from his hiding spot behind the couch. Eddie decided to use a distracting noise as a prelude to his jump scare, something that would give his grandfather a slight jolt while setting him up for the big payoff. Eddie pulled his car keys out of his pocket and began shaking them, causing the keys to jingle, softly at first, and then louder as his excitement grew. The noise caught his grandfather's attention, making him mute the TV and turn his head, scanning the room for the source of the sound. In that moment of distraction, Eddie saw his chance. He sprang up from behind the couch, the gargoyle mask inches from his grandfather's face, and let out a bone-chilling roar. The mask, combined with the suddenness of the scare, was actually more terrifying than Eddie had originally intended. His grandfather's reaction was immediate and shocking. His eyes went wide with fright, and a gasp escaped his lips as he clutched his chest. The remote control fell from his hand, clattering onto the floor. For a split second, Eddie felt a surge of triumph at the success of his prank, but that feeling vanished as quickly as it came when he realized something was terribly wrong. Eddie's grandfather began to slump forward, gripping his chest, breaths coming in short, strained gasps. Eddie's grandfather suddenly rolled off the couch and collapsed into a heap on the floor. Panic suddenly replaced the thrill in Eddie's heart. He ripped off the mask and threw it aside, rushing to his grandfather's aid. "Grandpa!" he cried, his voice laced with genuine fear. But his words fell on deaf ears. His grandfather's eyes were closed, and he laid eerily still. Eddie's world crumbled in that moment. The realization that his prank had gone horribly, unfathomably wrong, guilt and fear crashing down on him. In a panic, Eddie frantically called 911, but by the time the paramedics got there, it was too late. Eddie's grandfather had died from cardiac arrest. It was later revealed that the news Eddie's grandfather was about to tell him on the night they had dinner together was that he had been recently diagnosed with congestive heart failure, meaning his grandfather's heart was in a weakened state and was unable to handle the stress of Eddie's practical joke. This was the primary reason that Eddie's grandfather had decided to visit with him. After receiving the news of his diagnosis, he wasn't sure if he had much time left, and so he wanted to make every moment count, especially with his beloved grandson, Eddie. Unfortunately, however, when Eddie jumped up from behind the couch wearing that horrific gargoyle mask, knowing full well that his grandfather was unaware of his presence in the apartment, the old man's heart simply couldn't take the shock. His death was swift and brutal. The days that followed were a blur of tears, guilt, and disbelief. Eddie's prank, meant to elicit laughter and perhaps a light scolding, had instead ended in the most tragic way imaginable. The funeral was a somber affair, with relatives and friends offering their condolences, their eyes filled with genuine sorrow and hurt. Eddie could also feel the piercing stares of the family members who were well aware of what he had done, their eyes heavy with unspoken blame. No one said it to him directly, but he could feel the weight of their thoughts. This was his fault. Eddie's heart was a tangled mess of grief and guilt. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and he found no joy in the pranks and jokes that once filled his days with laughter and a sense of power and control. Eddie's apartment now felt empty. The silence, a constant reminder of the presence that was suddenly missing. The already toxic relationships Eddie had with his parents deteriorated even further. His mother, already distant, became even more withdrawn. Her interactions with Eddie strained and minimal. His father's temper always seemed to be simmering just below the surface. Every time Eddie entered into his parents' house, he felt as if he was trying to avoid stepping on a landmine, fearing one could explode at any moment. Eddie was totally devastated. Although he never spent much time around his grandfather over the course of his life, he felt like he was the only one who truly loved and cared about him, especially when he considered how unhealthy the relationships were that he had with his immediate family, namely his parents. But now, his grandfather was dead, and it was all his fault. The death of Eddie's grandfather changed him in ways he never could have imagined. He stopped scaring and playing practical jokes on people, becoming more mature and responsible. Eddie began reaching out to family and friends in an attempt to heal the relationships he had destroyed and to mend the bridges he had burned. As Eddie offered sincere apologies, asking for forgiveness, the responses he received were mixed. Some were happy to hear that Eddie had finally grown up. Meanwhile, others were more hesitant and openly skeptical. But each conversation and each connection felt like a step away from the darkness and into the light. One year later, Eddie had moved on with his life. He had found a new job, which did provide him with a sense of purpose and meaning. And he also had a girlfriend now, and things between them were looking promising. However, the pain of his grandfather's death still lingered, a persistent pain in his heart that refused to fade. A constant reminder of the bond they shared and the void that was left behind. One morning, Eddie was in the shower preparing to go to work, the water washing over his body, causing him to become lost in thought. Suddenly, he heard what sounded like someone calling his name.
Eddie.
Now, this confused Eddie, who was in his apartment alone and couldn't understand how someone could have been calling him. Eddie shrugged it off and began washing his hair. Standing under the shower head, with the warm water streaming down, Eddie felt a chill crawl up his spine. The voice echoed once more through the steam of his hot shower.
Eddie.
This time, it was louder, closer, and more urgent. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. He quickly rinsed the shampoo from his eyes and turned off the water, standing completely still and listening intently. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with anticipation. Eddie's mind raced. Was he imagining things? Was the stress of his grandfather's death finally getting to him? Wrapping a towel around himself, Eddie cautiously stepped out of the shower, his eyes scanning the small bathroom. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt different, as if charged with a silent warning. Eddie shook his head, trying to dispel the eerie feeling that had taken hold of him. "I'm just imagining things," he muttered to himself, trying his best to sound convincing. Later that day, while Eddie was at work, stocking shelves and stacking boxes. His boss ordered him to retrieve some items from their storage area in the back of the retail store. Eddie grabbed a dolly and headed towards the dimly lit storage area, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. The storage room was at the far end, a place rarely visited and often forgotten, filled with old stock and dusty shelves. As he unlocked the door and pushed it open, a cold draft greeted him, sending shivers down his spine. Eddie flicked on the lights, but only a few flickered to life, casting long shadows across the room. Eddie began searching for the items on his list, moving deeper into the storage area. And that's when he heard it again. Eddie froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to run, to get the hell out of that creepy storage room, but he couldn't get his feet to move.
Why did you scare me?
The voice was sad, filled with disappointment and pain. Eddie's eyes widened in terror as he began to suspect that the creepy voice was that of his late grandfather. Who else would be asking him such a personal question? And who else would sound so heartbroken? His grandfather's voice, once a source of comfort, now a source of unimaginable fear. He turned around, half expecting to see his grandfather standing there. But the room was empty, save for the shadows dancing on the walls.
You need to learn, Eddie. You need to understand.
The voice was everywhere now, enveloping Eddie in a cocoon of guilt and remorse. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered more aggressively, as if reacting to the ominous presence. The terrifying voice screamed at Eddie like a banshee from hell, and Eddie darted out of that storage room like there was no tomorrow. He fled down the corridor, sprinting like a deer being chased by a ravenous predator. When Eddie got back to the front of the retail store, his eyes were wide like saucers, and he was gasping for breath. His boss and co-workers asked him what the hell was wrong, but Eddie was so panicked he could barely speak. Knowing there was no chance in hell anyone was going to believe what had just happened, Eddie decided to fake illness and told his boss and co-workers he needed to go home for the day. As Eddie drove home, his mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Was he losing his mind? The road Eddie was driving on felt endless as he struggled to piece together the horrifying events of the day. In truth, Eddie was finally getting a taste of his own medicine. For years, he had abused and tormented those around him, only to end up on the receiving end of the same terror he so willingly inflicted on others. Little did Eddie know, however, that this was only the beginning of his nightmare. In an attempt to get his mind off his troubles, Eddie decided to call his new girlfriend. The sweet and comforting sound of her feminine voice soothed Eddie, who was teetering on the edge and desperate for a sense of normalcy. He made no mention of his terrifying incident at work, since he was trying his absolute best to forget it even happened. Eddie's girlfriend told him she would stop by the next day to pay him a visit, and Eddie was thrilled as he was in need of some emotional support. After their brief conversation, Eddie began to feel lighter and more relaxed, He was so looking forward to seeing his girlfriend the following day, and given the stress that he was under, he was eager for the chance to enjoy her company. Eddie's heart sank into his stomach as he heard the terrifying voice once again. Eddie then began apologizing to the creepy voice that by now he was pretty confident was his grandfather. Eddie began telling his grandfather how he had turned over a new leaf and no longer found pleasure in terrorizing people. Suddenly, Eddie briefly glanced into his rearview mirror, and what he saw froze his blood. His grandfather's decomposing corpse was sitting in the back seat of his car, smiling at him with a most malevolent and sinister grin. His skin was rotting and peeling, and his eyes hollow and empty, yet somehow they bore right into Eddie's very soul. Eddie screamed at the top of his lungs as his car began violently swerving all over the road, barely keeping control. Eddie's grandfather began lurching from the back seat, reaching for him with his rotten and decomposing hands. Eddie's car continued swerving across the road, barely missing other vehicles as he struggled to keep it under control. Eddie's screams reverberated through the air as he was torn between two battles, one for maintaining control of his car, and the other for defending himself against the angry ghost of his grandfather, who seemed determined to drag Eddie into the very depths of hell right along with him. It was a nightmarish tug of war, with Eddie caught desperately in the middle, fighting for his very survival. Suddenly, Eddie looked up and saw he was about to have a head-on collision with an 18-wheeler. Gripping the wheel with all his might, Eddie violently swerved off the road and came to a screeching halt on the shoulder, nearly colliding with a row of concrete barriers. Gasping for breath, Eddie looked into his rearview mirror again, only to find that the terrifying apparition of his grandfather had disappeared. Eddie began to slowly turn around, half expecting to still see the rotting corpse of his grandfather, still sitting in the back seat of his car. But there was nothing. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. Finally, the authorities arrived. They asked Eddie endless questions, trying to determine his sobriety and his sanity. They made Eddie walk in a straight line, complete a sobriety test, and they even asked him to say the alphabet backwards, taking every measure to ensure he was in a fit mental state to provide a coherent account of what had transpired. Now, Eddie knew damn well they weren't going to believe the real story, so he made something up. He simply said that he had swerved to avoid a deer that had suddenly darted out in front of his car. Obviously, the officers were skeptical of this explanation, but without any evidence to the contrary, they had no choice but to accept his account of what had happened. Eddie had lucked out, and as the officers finished up their investigation, Eddie climbed back into the driver's seat of his car, shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, and the memory of his grandfather's ghostly apparition was seared into his mind. He could not believe what had just happened. It truly felt like a nightmare come to life. Once the officers were satisfied and allowed Eddie to leave, he quickly got back on the road, desperate to get home so he could put this day behind him. His heart was pounding, and his hands trembled on the steering wheel. He kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his grandfather's ghastly face lurking in the back seat again. As he drove, Eddie's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. How was this possible? His grandfather was dead. He had seen the body himself at the damn funeral. Yet, the apparition he had encountered in the car felt so tangible, so real. Was the guilt he felt for what he had done to his grandfather causing him to go mad? Just what the hell was going on? The further he drove, the more Eddie's panic began to subside, replaced by a growing sense of dread. At this point, all Eddie wanted to do was go home and get some sleep. Unfortunately, however, when Eddie arrived home, he was frustrated to find out that he wasn't able to sleep a wink. The day's events kept replaying in his mind over and over again like a skipping CD. In addition, Eddie was still feeling remorseful for the many years he spent terrorizing his family and friends with his senseless and often dangerous practical jokes. Now that he was on the receiving end, he realized just how cruel and inconsiderate his actions had been. Eddie was also frustrated by the fact that although he had made every effort to change his behavior and make amends with everyone, he still seemed to be paying the price for his past. Essentially, Eddie was learning the painful lesson that karma's a bitch. Eddie lay awake in the dark, tossing, turning, and ruminating. Finally, in a fit of frustration, Eddie threw the covers off himself and decided he would venture into the living room to watch a bit of TV. He figured that maybe some mindless entertainment would help distract him from his thoughts and ease his restlessness. Eddie sat down on the couch. Grabbing the remote control, he began mindlessly channel surfing. The flickering, flashing images from the television screen illuminated Eddie's dark apartment, hypnotizing him and drawing him further into the world of distraction. So far, Eddie's decision to get up and watch some TV seemed to be working. He was becoming increasingly relaxed, and his mind was slowly clearing of all the stress and turmoil. Finally, Eddie stumbled across an episode of one of his favorite TV shows. Eddie was overjoyed as he sank deeper into the couch, the familiar theme song filling the room. However, not even 5 minutes after the episode started, Eddie began to hear a strange noise. It sounded like a pair of keys jingling. Eddie immediately muted the television, listening very intently to the sound that seemed to be coming from directly behind the couch. Eddie thought to himself, just as he was starting to relax and enjoy some much-needed entertainment, an out-of-place noise was putting him back on edge. Suddenly, he heard the noise again, this time louder and closer. A chill ran down Eddie's spine, and he began to slowly turn his head in the direction of the noise. Once again, it sounded as if it was coming from directly behind the couch. Eddie was totally terrified. His heart was pounding in his chest as he sat on the couch, frozen with fear. There it was again. What the hell was that? Eddie swallowed hard as he began to realize he couldn't sit on the couch forever. No one was coming to his rescue, and it was totally up to him to investigate the source of that chilling noise. Finally, Eddie took a deep breath as he braced himself to peer over the back of the couch. Steadying himself, he slowly began to rise from the spot on the couch where he had been sitting, his eyes fixed on the spot where the sound originated. With both hands now gripping the back of the couch, Eddie put his knee into the seat cushion and carefully hoisted himself up, his heart beating a mile a minute. The following morning, Eddie's girlfriend, who just happened to have a key to his place, made her way to his apartment as she had promised the previous day. As she stepped inside the quiet, still space, she couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. She called out for Eddie, but there was no response. The usually vibrant and lively atmosphere was now replaced by an unsettling emptiness. Her heart began to race, a sense of unease creeping up her spine like an icy finger. Her eyes scanned the room, the natural order of things seeming to be undisturbed. Yet, as her gaze drifted towards the living room, she gasped, her world shattering into a million shards of shock and disbelief. There, on the cold, hard floor, lay Eddie, his body pale and lifeless. Eddie's eyes, once vibrant and full of life, were now wide open, staring blankly up at the ceiling. His face frozen in a look of shock and terror. The sight was so horrifying that Eddie's girlfriend could barely comprehend what she was seeing. Her screams echoed through the apartment, shattering the oppressive silence as the horrifying reality of the situation began to sink in. The room around her seemed to blur and spin as she stumbled backwards, her screams and wailing sending shock waves through the entire complex. Tragically, Eddie met the same fate as his grandfather, whom he had accidentally frightened to death exactly 1 year prior. As Eddie cautiously investigated the jingling sound behind his couch, he was confronted by the horrific, decomposing face of his grandfather's ghost. The sheer terror caused Eddie to go into cardiac arrest, just as his prank had done to his grandfather. Ironically, the parallel between Eddie's death and the way he had previously killed his grandfather created a chilling sense of poetic justice. In the end, Eddie's reckless behavior had come back to haunt him in the most devastating way imaginable. Poor Eddie. His fetish for scaring the living daylights out of people was born out of a desperate need to reclaim his self-esteem and personal power. Unfortunately, however, his twisted game of terror only served to further isolate him from the ones he loved the most. Always remember that even when you've learned from your past mistakes and genuinely tried to make amends, the consequences of your previous actions may still linger. If you have a long history of harmful behavior, you don't simply get to move on as if nothing ever happened, no matter how much you think you may have grown or changed. Because when karma catches up to you, it often pays you back tenfold, hitting you hard and leaving its indelible mark in your ass.
Karma's a bitch, Eddie. If you enjoyed this presentation, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Until the next tale of terror, this is Victor Bloodborne. Stay dreadful.